Welcome to Watercolor and Wonder. This series will be following Ambleside Online's nature study topics. Right now we're doing invertebrates, and this video will be a real-time painting of a land snail. So this is meant for those students or parents who are just would like some extra help with how to achieve the results they are wanting when they're trying to draw what they're observing. So I'm going to walk through in real time. I'm going to show you the picture that I've based my observations on. That I've already released the snail, so he's gone, but I took some photos, and so I'm going to be painting from that, and then hopefully you have either a snail to observe in person or have also taken some photos to use as a reference as you're documenting that for your journals. And what I'm going to walk through is just what I'm thinking about in terms of color, how I map out the actual sketch of it, and then how to achieve that using watercolor to look like the photo that I'm referencing. So you can follow along with me. I hope this is a help, especially if you've been frustrated with what you're seeing and what you're trying to document, and their two just aren't lining up as you had hoped. Of course, this is not meant to be perfectly beautiful, but meant to be more just really close observation and trying to document what we're really seeing. And so that's what I'm going to try to do in these videos, and just help you see the colors, see the details that I'm seeing, and then how to translate that into your journal. So I hope this is really helpful to you. Stick around and we will get started. All right, so let's dive in to drawing a snail. Now you can see my reference photo zoomed in pretty well. I did observe these snails in person, but it's much easier for me to make my observations live and then make my drawings and paintings from a reference photo that I took. So that's what I'm doing today. I start with the general shape. So I'm gonna, snail's nice. So we have this nice round shell, right? So we start with this big circle. Obviously, this is not to scale. I want to be able to see all the details of this cool creature. And so I sketch it out very lightly, just a plain old pencil, not using drawing pencils or anything like that. And I get the basic shape, so I make sure I have space for all the things that I want to be able to include with my drawing. Here, you could even go more basic than this and just make two ovals to get it, sketched in. So we get this guy coming up here, and his head coming up and over. Now, you might live in a different part of the country, or different part of the world for that matter, and maybe your snails don't look quite like mine. So I hope that you are able to make your own observations, and hopefully I have room for his, I hope we called them pegs or antenna or eye pegs. I'm not a scientist, so I may not use all the right words, but I will help you get it documented visually, which is my goal, to help you. So we get these in, and notice mine taper, so they're not the same length all the way through, and we have this little eye on the end, and same with these. Okay, that's my basic drawing. I might come back in, there's one, I can see the line of its body if you look very closely, kind of comes up here. And that's my basic outline. I'll add in a little detail here now for our shell. We'll go back now that we have our main shape, and I'm happy with that. I'll add in a few little details. So we start here, coming up and around. The wonderful thing about pencil is it doesn't have to be perfect, and if it's not, if you're not pleased with it, you can always try again, right? Erase it. But don't get too hung up. So I noticed this guy kind of comes in, and we have a new green coming over here. See, I lost it there. This was here. And then this one comes, see, even though I'm following it, my eyes are getting a little tricked by all the circles. This one comes up and out and right into there. All right, that's our basic. I'll go back and clean that up a bit. Right. This one came up and over here, kind of like that, because we're paying attention. The wonderful thing about nature journaling is that I'm not drawing what I think a snail looks like. I'm drawing what an actual snail looks like, which are usually two very different things, right? What I would say in my head a snail shell should do, or from my memory, and what I actually see the snail shell doing are not the same thing. So you want to be careful to keep looking closely, drawing what you see. I'm just going back to check it, and I see that this it tapers off right here, and a new one comes in. And then the pattern is really obscured, but there are these light ridges which we can add with paint. That's all I'm going to do with sketching. I got my shape. This can all be erased later. If we want to do a pen outline, we can do that next. All right, so let's get to painting. The colors are not very dramatic, right? We're gonna definitely I'm gonna start with a neutral tint, which is a black, and I think I'm gonna use a lot of that because it's a pretty dark animal creature. And then I'm just continually looking back, and of course I have some brown in here, so I'm gonna use a brown. I'm just gonna have these ready. When I watercolor, I like to look closely at my colors and try to match them before I ever begin painting. It's much easier to do a watercolor if you have the paint ready to go. Okay, so I definitely have a deep dark brown. I'm gonna need to darken that even more with some shadows and so I can mix up, maybe I can mix up a little neutral tint. Ooh, I've got some pencil eraser there. Maybe neutral tint and brown together already, so I don't pollute the two I just separated there, because I think I'm gonna need that also. And then mine has some gold, my land snail here. So I'll clean off my paintbrush in between, just wiping it off. And I'm gonna do, like I have this gold, I'm just gonna look and I'm gonna pull that up and say, like, does that look like the same thing? I don't know that it does, but maybe if I add another brown to it, or even maybe some medium yellow, I think we'll have to dull it down. And if you think about a color wheel, to dull a color like this is clearly too bright for our snail. We need the color that's opposite it on the color wheel. Opposite yellow or gold on a color wheel is violet. So I'm gonna get just a teensy bit of violet, and I'm gonna dull that down. And I feel like that's getting a little closer to what I want. That's way too much. That's a lot closer to what I want for my snail. Okay, so that covers all of the shell. Those are the colors that I'm seeing in the shell. And so our neutral tint is both the black and a gray. I see both of those colors there. And then I'm gonna move on to the body. I'm seeing a gray. So I already have that ready here. And I see a slightly greenish gray maybe. It's a tricky color, right? So I'm gonna pull this. I'm gonna see maybe a little brown on that, and I'm gonna add a little bit of like a dull green, so you can see that's a dark green. Where did my dull green go? We'll try this one. Like more of an olivey green, just a little bit to change that neutral shade. That looks pretty close to the shades I'm seeing on the the underside of the body. And then I'm just gonna get another gray going here with a little bit of brown in it. Not as much as I had before in our other. See, I think those two shades will get us where we're going here. Okay, I feel pretty good about moving forward with painting now. So I've got the shell colors here, all here, and the body here. And because my painting's not that big, I didn't mix up a lot. I think it's gonna go pretty quickly. So I'm gonna start with the lightest colors, which is the gold, of course. So I'm gonna start on the shell, and I'm gonna look at where I'm seeing some gold. And I'm seeing it all through here. The wonderful thing about watercolor, one of the wonderful things, I like a lot of things about it, it's very versatile and it's not permanent. If you mess up, you can just blot it off. Most of the time you can remedy. So I'm just gonna put some gold. I see tiny bits, mostly on this outer ring, this gold color. I'm just gonna put it there because it's gonna be really easy to cover this up with darker colors, but it's not as easy to go back in and add lighter colors. So I'm just gonna add a little bit there. I see a little bit maybe right here. And then also on this little lip. So we're gonna put that in there. Okay. Another thing about watercolor, we need, maybe a little bit here. Maybe. It's hard to tell also because they're so slimy and they have so many reflections on their shell. All right, while that's drying, because we don't want to add our darker colors, well, you can if you want. I guess if we want it to blend a little, we can go ahead and add some darker color. Let's go for it. Let's do it, right? So I'm gonna start with a little bit of this gray, or maybe even a little bit of the brown. I'm gonna keep working on this outer shell. And you see how it blends a lot. So I'm gonna give it a try here. See if it's blending too much for what I want, or if I'm okay with it. I think I'm okay with what it's doing because there's not a lot of gold, right? Most of that does need to be covered up. So I'm okay with the fact that it's gonna kind of take over there. So let's just fill this in. I am gonna keep my rings distinct though. So no, that's the way it goes, right? With watercolor, right as you say it, it's gonna do the opposite. But I can just do this and take it right out. See? Easy enough. So we're gonna come back up in here. I'm just using the brown only right now because again, I'm working lightest to darkest. I'm gonna do my brown next, and then I'm going to go into my brown and neutral tint, or brown and black that I mixed up, and then I'll finalize it with just the neutral tint to add the deepest shades. Because that's definitely not the same as the snail that I observed, right? It's much darker. So I don't want to go quite there yet. And because it's still wet, I can just dot this on and it's going to blend nicely for me. I'm looking at where those shadows are and I'm bringing that around to add that in. And by doing this on the edges, that will add some definition to our shape. That's what's going to give us the 3D that we want for what we are illustrating. Okay, now we can go in add the darkest. For the first layer, you're probably going to need to do this a couple of times because it's going to spread out, and as it spreads, it will lighten. I'm not trying to keep any of those highlights clear right now. I'm going to go back in with a gouache to add all the white highlighted reflections. So I'm okay with this just taking over in the shadows. And you can see I've almost used up all my neutral tint already. It's just a really dark specimen. That's the way it's going to go. I'm going to go ahead and mix up some more. So I have that ready. I don't paint directly from my wells. That's just too intense of a color, and I also just waste watercolor. Watercolor is meant to be used most of the time with water, so I work from my mixing areas most of the time. We're going to go ahead and go. I'm just dabbing along the edges and adding in these nice dark shadows. Mostly here and here, because up here is where my light is hitting, and so there's just not as many shadows there. We've got a little bit of water pooling up, and that tends to happen. What you do is you can just wipe off all the water and paint from your brush and touch it, and then you have what's called a thirsty brush, and it will just take some of that water out. You don't really want to leave pools of water, because as it dries, it will push your paint and create like these cauliflowery like edges that you don't really want most of the time. If you want them, then absolutely do that, but usually you don't want that to happen. So to prevent it, you can pick that up. All right, so now I think I actually need to add some more brown in to combat those nice shadows we just did right here in the front, especially, and maybe a little bit back here. Okay, I'm gonna let that fill in a couple of spots here that are holding out on me. I'm gonna let that dry. Maybe, I keep saying that, but then I look back at my picture and say, oh, but I need more gold. It's wiped out my gold, which is easy enough to do. So beautiful. What a cool creature. Okay, now I'm gonna, because I have a little bit of a space right here that's not wet, I'm able to go over and paint the body while this is drying. And so when that's dry, then I can come back for the next loop of the shell. But you don't want, as you saw earlier, it will obviously bleed into the next one. Because these are going to be the same color, this doesn't really matter. But these are not the same color, so I really want to keep them separate, so I'm going to be more careful there. Okay, so I'm going to, again, work with my lightest shade to my darkest. And as I'm looking, which is what happens, once you look, you might see, oh, I need a different color than what I thought I did. I'm going to start with a very, very light tan right here, and I'm going to add a lot of water to lighten it up. That's way too dark for what I wanted, so I'm going to pull some of that out and then just keep going. Okay, so I've got this, and then I'm going to work in next this greenish gray, which is what I'm seeing underside here. And we're just going to let this work its way around, do some wonderful blending, and pull it right up into here. and even all the way out here onto that feeler. Because it's almost translucent, which means it's more of this shade. I mean, it is translucent, that's why we could see, maybe, hopefully you got to see the eye slide up and down as it. And again, because we're working with our lightest shade, I can go ahead and cover most of this area. Even if that's not the color it's going to stay, it's going to lay that first layer down and it's going to allow it all to blend really well. And then we can do what is known as the wet on wet technique, because now it's all wet with our first and lightest color. I am going to bring it down into this because I don't want a really harsh line between the body and that bottom, I don't know if they call that a foot, with this little piece that came out and helps it to scoot along. I don't want a really distinct line. There is a line there, but it's very subtle. So we can add that definition later. Okay, so there's all of our first color with the highlighted part right here. And I'm even going to go back in now and just pick up some of it. I want to keep that part light to show where the light and the shadows are hitting. So you can see already, just letting that watercolor do cool things. We do need to add more shadow though, because it's not really the color of our snail. So I'm going to add in our gray here and let it just blend and do cool things. And definitely all along the back. And then underneath the shell we have some really good shadows, which we'll be adding even more in shortly. But over here, it doesn't get that dark, right? Now it's trying to encroach on the part that I want it to be light. I can just push it back while I'm working. There we go. And I can, again, take it out if I don't want it there. Easy enough. Okay, so we keep looking back at our photo. I'm gonna add, I don't think that straight, like this black looks a little bit too, looks like it has a little bit of blue in it. So I'm gonna add just a tiny bit of brown here, just to soften it and make it work with the color we need it to work with, be the color we need it to be. There's a real dark spot right here and over here. If yours starts drying out, just add some water, no big deal. I'm going to add even more brown because I really think that's more of the tone that we're working with. I'm just going to keep putting it in the places where it is the darkest, and I'm going to let it blend. I feel like we're getting pretty close for this part. All the detail that you see, the little lines and dots and bumps, those we have to add once it's dry. But this base layer, we're going to get the basic colors. Now you can see mine's pooling again. So I got to pull some of that out because I don't want it to sit in a puddle and push my paint around where I don't want it. I can always go back in and add another layer of paint. And that's much easier to do. Alright, and the last thing I'm going to do here is I'm going to go ahead and paint those antennae back. It's the much lighter green color. And again, if I'm using the wrong terms, feel free to tell me in the comments. I'm not a scientist, but I'm just trying to pay attention, right? Trying to pay attention and learn something. And this is a real dark on the end, so I'm going to go ahead and add some of that. I lost all my darkest paint, so I'm going to mix that up. There we go. And the same for the other side. I'm going to paint that light greeny gray, because this is just a much, and we can add in our shadows and tones shortly. Okay, this one does, so I'm just going to dot only on the edge and let it blend inward toward the center on each side. I'm just going to do that really carefully because I want that little bit of a shadow and I want it to soften before this dries. And the same with this, we're going to add just a line. See, this one's more dry now, so I have to, if that happens, you can wipe your brush off and just take water to make a soft edge. And I'm going to push this back a little bit. Pull this back a little bit to keep some of that lighter color clear. Okay, I'm just going to check over here. This is still wet in the middle, but I think it's enough that we can move to the next ring. So I'm going to go in there with a brown, again working lightest to darkest, and we're just laying down the color. So I've almost used all my brown here. And this just gets so dark, there's not a lot of color variation in this section, which is fine. I'll come back in with some gold at the end since we let it dry. And I'm still following my pencil marks, so I'm trying to at least keep those lines of where the shell comes in and out. And I'm going to come back in now and add that darker shade. This is just the brown and the black mixed together. Keep looking at your photo. Keep paying attention. And then I'm going to come on down into here. This last ring. Now I do want to be careful. If this is still wet, you don't want to touch it or it will bleed over, and those colors are not the same. You really don't want to get any of this lighter brown or gold into that body of the snail, so keep that separate. Okay, just cleaning up the edges a little here. Letting that dry. We're going to let that dry before we proceed. And then I'm going to go ahead and pull that all the way up there. And then because we're getting here to this lip, and I don't want these to intermingle, and then I also don't want this to completely bleed in. Do you see how by waiting, you can see the line the definition between the rings just by that letting it dry mostly. I want to keep that as I continue in, so I'm going to walk away for a few moments and just let this dry completely before I move forward. 15 minutes should be sufficient. Okay, our snail is definitely dry. We're going to finish up this now. So we're going to move into the inner ring, which I'm looking at. It's slightly more gray than brown, so I'm just going to add that here, and especially in the very middle, which is where I'm going to start. That's a very light gray. And we're going to put that in, and I'm just going to go ahead and give this all a light coat. I still follow the lines, I guess out of habit, even though I'm painting it all the same color. And so this circle will be a little light gray. While that dries, which shouldn't take too long, it's not nearly as much as we put on the other layers, I'm going to come down to the lip. That's also going to be this brownish black, and we're going to move that in here. We can see as we paint that in, and it moves into the gold. I'm just going to keep right around the edge of that here, and then moving back, it does have a little bit of our gold color, so I'm going to add that in just like that, and then finish it up with a darker color here. Okay, so looking at my reference color photo, you can see that I'm just going to build this in. Right here. Blend it up. Okay. There we go. Now we gotta look back at our photo and check back to see what we need to do. So I'm gonna pull that over so that this still needs to dry a moment. So we're gonna go over here to the body of our snail again. I'm gonna add in the next layer, just a little bit darker on the top and under the edge of the shell. So we can add that in. I can see it kind of coming up just right through there. And then also right here and on the underside of that. To soften that edge, I just wipe off my brush and I just drag without paint, just a little bit of water, and so it will soften that in. I'm gonna do the same thing underneath. Again, not getting too close to that lip though that we just painted, or it will bleed over. But down here it is very dark. And so we can begin to add some of the definition to this now, just by adding the other layer. I can see there's even more of that green, or even almost a brown color in here. Okay. This does seem to have a slight brown, so I'm going to add that to warm up the tone just a little bit. Not so much out here. And then I'm going to go back in again along the edge and really darken that, because that's pretty dark. Pitch black under there. Again, just make sure you're not painting anywhere that's still wet. are the darkest spots I'm seeing now. But notice along the edge it does lighten just a little. So instead of painting it the darkest black, I'm just going to go in with a dark brown. So it still gets darker, but it's not as dark as those black parts. Same for over here. This is still pretty dark, but not that dark. I see a pretty good shadow right here. All the way up. We can just keep adding those layers until we get it to the color that we really see. Let me pull that down. Okay, I'm also going to go back in, fill in that. And right here. And now this last bit here on the shell, kind of golden, but dark down here along the bottom. So I'm going to mix some of my goldish and dark brown together. And I'm going to add that through here. I'm not going to go all the way to this edge though, because I want to paint this last section pretty quickly. Okay, then I need a real bit of dark black and gray to finish this up. So we're going to go in right here. That's much darker than what we just did, so I'm gonna go over that again. And it's darker even through this ring. Take some of that paint out and lighten it as I come in. Okay, I think that gives us a pretty good sketch for our, I'm gonna actually darken a couple other spots of shadow just on the eyes. And the back of the shell. Like along each layer here, it's a little bit darker, and that's just going to give us that definition between layers. I'm just going to go through the same thing here. Just tracing that outline with some dark brown black. And I'm going to do the same thing. I don't think this is dry enough. When this dries, I'm going to do the same thing here. We're going to trace this. And this is much darker right here as well. Same thing for the top of this, so just keep looking at your photo, looking for those shadows are. shadows are right here. Okay, the last thing I'm gonna do is I'm gonna let this dry one more time, and then I'm gonna add in the texture, which is going to be two colors. It's going to be like a dark gray brown, shocking for this painting, I know, to add in all these little lines on the body, and then some of the lines on the shell, and also a little bit of white to add some of the highlights or the reflections, because a snail is slimy and it's going to always reflect the light, and so those white highlights will show that. I use a white gouache for that. So I'm going to add those in as soon as this is dry, and we'll go from there. Okay, so our final step is to just add some of the texture, and we do that by all the little lines. So I'm going to go through, mine has all these little dashes all pointing the same direction, and you're just going to use just a gray, brown. It's a surprise at this point, right? Just these little dash marks. I'm just going in a very, I don't see any pattern to them. And I see them coming right up all the way out here. Even, I'm going to use a lighter shade for the antenna, but I do see them even on the antenna. Just real light. And like these little details are what's going to make your painting really look real and take it from just take it to the next level. These little texture details. All the way back. You can kind of add, I see that there's even a bit of a line here. Okay, and then I'm going to do the same thing on the shell. Instead of the black though, I'm just going to use a bit of a brown, and I have these lines that are going kind of a curved shape. I'm obviously not going to draw every one of them, but I'm going to give the idea of them and the direction of them. All pointing in, but curving slightly backward. And of course, even with all the time we took on this, you could spend a lot more time adding more detail to this drawing. But I think the goal has been achieved when we can capture all these things that we've done. And finally up in here, all the way around. And the last thing we do then is the highlights. I always do highlights last because you never know, you might find something you want. You're like, oh, I didn't see that, I want to add it at the last minute. And it's really hard to do that if you've already added highlights. So I just get a little bit of my gouache, and I'm going to go through. And this will make the painting just be so much more realistic. These are kind of like just squiggly lines around those little texture marks, right? So they're almost going in circles at points. They're coming up here. But mine are only just on the back where the light was hitting clearest. Comes up even along that, and even a tiny bit out here, right? I see a little bit through here. And here. Just kind of dotting that in as I see it, letting my hand, not necessarily looking at every line as I'm painting it, looking at the photo and bouncing back and forth. A little bit in here. It's not as reflective, so there's not as much reflection on this part. But there is a little, even up to here. Okay. And then if you really want to add the last and make this pop to look real, you can add your shadow on the surface it was sitting on. Which I like to do. Makes me feel like it's just right there crawling off my page. And again, not painting where I think the shadows are or I imagine they are. I'm painting where they actually were. Sometimes shadows even will surprise you in what they do and where they pop up. There we go. Land snail extraordinary. Thanks for joining me today. I hope you found this really helpful and that it has allowed you to progress in your documenting of your nature journal. So hopefully you'll tune in again and we will paint some more together. Have a great day.